All right.
So I know people came late.
Hey, Lee,
Fill in
Lee.
the back, but if we can move over
We're getting
here.
ready, we're starting.
Yeah, if we can move everybody over here, then we'll be more of a little.
You guys are, wherever you feel comfortable is fine. Thanks. Hi, everybody, and welcome to North Brooklyn Political Ed. Should I speak in a microphone or is this okay? Maybe I'll take this. Tonight is our second to last class of the semester. We're so happy to have Liza Featherstone joining us to talk on gender and capitalism. But first, just a word about why we do political education. We're here doing, I'm trying to get this camera nice. We're here doing political education to strengthen our activism in studying social movements. We can learn from our predecessors, both from what succeeded and what was less effective. Studying theory, we can strengthen our critical thinking skills, sharpen our analysis, better understand what we're up against in the struggle, and therefore better strategize and craft more persuasive arguments. Good strategy and compelling arguments can be the difference between winning and losing any given campaign. So we're all in this to hopefully advance, to move forward, and we're so interested to hear what Liza has to say tonight on gender and capitalism. So, sorry, hybrid is a bit of a challenge. I know. Oh, come on, sorry. I'm about to give you Liza's beautiful background. Okay, so again, we're here not just to learn from texts, but also to learn from one another. And Liza Featherstone is a good comrade. She's a member of DSA. She's also a very accomplished writer. She is a columnist at Jacobin and the New Republic, as well as a contributing writer at The Nation. She's also the author of Divining Desire, Focus Groups and the Culture of Consultation, published by OR Books in 2018, as well as Selling Women Short, the landmark battle for workers' rights at Walmart. She co-authored Students Against Sweatshops and is editor of False Choices, the Faux Feminism of Hillary Rodham Clinton. She's currently editing a collection of Alexandra Kollontai, how do you pronounce it? Kollontai, sorry, work for OR Books and international publishers, and she is writing the introduction to that volume. A journalist, essayist, and critic, Featherstone's work has been published in Lux, TV Guide, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Ms., the American Prospect, Columbia Journalism Review, Glamour, Teen Vogue, Dissent, The Guardian, In These Times, and many other publications. And again, she's also a proud member of DSA. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her, and we're so happy to hear her speak. So go ahead.
People in the melee space. So thank you for coming. I should say a little bit. This is really just one dimension of social feminism that I'm going to be talking about, because I think night school should be ideas. It's going to be a little bit more on the theorist side and on the side of what we experience in our daily lives, and there is also a vast history of labor activism and
sound check.
sound check.
I mean, sound. Please check your sound.
Please check my sound.
Yes.
Okay. How's that?
It's better. Thanks.
That sounds better to me.
Yeah.
Okay. So just a caveat, there's a lot more to socialist feminism than what I'm going to be talking about. The president of Harvard was surprised. Early in the pandemic, the president of Harvard University, Lawrence Bacow, and his wife Adele could not figure out how they had contacted COVID-19. They said they had not seen anyone except for each other for close to 10 days before they started experiencing symptoms. They said they were completely isolated in the house. this was not quite true. The student newspaper reported that 2 of the university's housekeeping staff had been cleaning the couple's home twice a week. A few days later, the 2 women came down with COVID-19 symptoms as well, but they hadn't seen anyone. In the bourgeois mind, workers disappeared, especially women of color performing traditional women's work. Their work is deemed necessary, essential even, remember essential workers, but paradoxically, the human beings performing that work are not particularly essential. Sexism is surely part of the story, but if we look at this particular situation, sexism alone would not capture how these human beings disappeared from the Harvard president's mind. Almost certainly, the president of Harvard and his wife are feminists. It was 2020. She is the CEO of an urban planning firm. The Beckos are probably what we would consider bourgeois feminists. This type of feminist, and we don't really use that term in daily life that much anymore. It's kind of an old-fashioned socialist term. We would usually now say liberal feminist, but for purposes of this discussion, we're going to use the term bourgeois feminist because it taps into a history, which I'm going to get into. But it's one of those kinds of probably alienating jargon that we maybe can't use, but it's fun to say it though, bourgeois. This type of feminism applauds the advance of women within the existing capitalist system. In this worldview, a woman's best hope is to become the CEO of her own company, as the president of Harvard's wife has done. And this is obviously an advance over how bourgeois society saw women in the past, right? In a traditional patriarchal view, which of course has not been completely eradicated, as we know. Adele Beckow, the president of Harvard's wife, should be happy to be just the wife of the president of Harvard. She could devote herself to the extensive labor that position would entail. She could throw teas, have dignitaries to dinner. She could that she can be a CEO and recognized for her own intelligence and societal contributions is a huge advance over that patriarchal view. And not just for her. Liberal feminism allows us to see women as humans who have contributions to make beyond the home. But there's a problem with this. Not that many women can become CEO of their own architecture firm. Bourgeois feminism has made great strides for the president of Harvard's wife, but almost no plan to improve the lives of women who clean her house. Many more women are in that position. Socialist feminism, by contrast, is concerned with the oppression of all workers by capital in general and by our bosses in particular, and is also concerned with all the ways women are oppressed as workers, both in the workplace, but also, whether paid or unpaid, performing the labor of nourishing life, whether caring for children, cleaning the house, hauling water around if you are a pastoral nomad in the desert, or wherever you may be, being pregnant, and a lot of other things, but those are some examples. Socialist feminists agree with liberal feminists that patriarchy is a problem. We recognize that the president of Harvard's wife deserves more to do more with her life than serve tea. We're happy for her. But we also think capitalism is the bigger problem, and that most people have more in common with Diana, her housekeeper, whose life can only get better in common struggle with her fellow workers against capital, like all of us. So it is that vast majority of what that really need a socialist society. In times of low class struggle, liberal feminism, bourgeois feminism, is merely inadequate, to the political challenges of fighting for women's liberation under capitalism. Liberal feminists can be our allies, fighting for abortion rights, equal pay for women workers, against sexual harassment in the workplace. But when socialism is on the march or even slightly on the rise, we see that sometimes bourgeois feminism can be used against socialism and can actually be a real political force against us. So Bolshevik thinker and leader Alexandra Kollontai, who was organizing and writing in the early 20th century in Russia before the revolution, used to heckle the meetings of the bourgeois feminists, seeing their project as deliberately divisive. She argued that by casting men as the enemy, they were casting men as the enemy, whereas working class people needed to get together and fight the boss class together. And I think that that's also something that we don't really talk very much about or are not very comfortable talking about. But socialist feminism has so much more to offer men than liberal feminism. And that in fact, liberal feminism, what reason would there be for men to be liberal feminists? I mean, I know that, I'm sure that many men in this room were feminists before you were socialists and because you're good people, and that's great. But if you look at, the men flocking to join the right wing, if you look for the men who are not voting for the Democratic Party, it's a sobering illustration of how little liberal feminism actually has to offer men. I'm not saying it's okay, like they shouldn't be doing that, but I'm just saying, thinking practically about our about political transformation, what we are offering is better for everybody. And here's an example of how Kollontais feminism was different from the bourgeois feminism of our time. So she was dedicated to sexual liberation for women. And she was not the only Victorian era thinker advocating sexual freedom for women for an end to conventional marriage. But she and her fellow communist women were different from bourgeois feminist sex radicals of her time in understanding that freedom had to have a material basis. So you might think free love, which they talked a lot about, was a silly hippie idea and not something that we should be talking about in socialist night school. And I won't argue that point, but I think we should always be thinking about how socialism can make everything in our lives better. So I think it's worth talking about. But I bring it up here because it shows how differently liberal and socialist feminists have approached the same issue. It's just as an example. So she wrote, in striving to change fundamentally the conditions of life, Alexandra Kollontai wrote of communist women, they know that they are also helping to reform relationships between the sexes. She wrote in 1909 that for some feminists, quote, the isolated heroic efforts of individuals is enough. Let a woman simply dare, quote unquote, and the problem of marriage is solved. But, Kollontai said, free love should not be available only to the quote unquote heroic. And if introduced into society as it existed, as capitalist society existed in 1909, it might, instead of freeing women from the hardship of family life, just, quote, shoulder her with a new burden, the task of caring alone and unaided for her children. So she was able to identify early on that certain kinds of social and cultural progress, if capitalism was left intact, could create even more complications for women. But she argued communism could make free love possible for women by socializing housework and childcare, as well as creating comfortable conditions for pregnant and nursing women. She imagined and created, actually, when she eventually served in the Bolshevik government, maternity homes in which women could be cared for during pregnancy and while nursing their babies. She worked to grant time off for all new mothers. If women knew that the state would support them as mothers and provide for their children, Kollontai reasoned, they would be much freer to pursue and enjoy, well, all of life, but also sex, as well as to work and fully participate in building communism. By contrast, then as now, liberal feminism was simply urging women to be more daring and bold. Lean in. In Kollontai's time, just as she noted, with the divisive man-hating, which we also see today, bourgeois feminism was used against socialism. So similarly, in 2016, and in to a lesser extent 2020, liberal feminism was deployed to undermine Bernie Sanders and his followers, representing them as sexist, rude, often comparing them to the male followers of Trump. Interestingly to me, showing how deeply opposed to mass politics liberals are, the very fact that Bernie Sanders appealed to men at all was often held against, like, look, he must be terrible, all these men are voting for him. And sometimes this was effective as a media narrative and as a way that some people came to understand the political situation. Just in the way that Kollontai identified in pre-revolutionary Russia as a strategy of division, bourgeois feminism can be effective as a class war strategy by the capitalists. So socialist feminism is a rich intellectual and activist tradition. And I have been especially interested in a conversation known as social reproduction theory, which has been enjoying a revival in recent years. It is not all, it sounds like a mouthful, social reproduction theory, but it is not all that theoretically complicated. The core insight is that while capitalist profit making is totally dependent on the essential work of caring for people, keeping them alive and healthy, that's what social reproduction theorist Tithi Bhattacharya has called the processes of life making. It is also completely at odds with this essential work. That is dependent on caregiving and life making, but it is at odds with it. Capitalists must make profits, and profits are impossible without workers. As Bhattacharya explains, capitalism depends on workers being alive and reproducing new generations of workers. At the same time, capitalists must perennially try to drive down the cost of life making. They don't want to pay high taxes, so the institutions that sustain life, parks, public schools, hospitals, must go underfunded. In fact, as Bhattacharya contends, when there's a crisis of profitability, those are the first institutions to suffer. Nannies, teachers, home health care workers must likewise be devalued, their labor kept underpaid or kept low or unpaid. And even the family wage of the 20th century, which allowed those sort of classic stereotypical housewives, to stay home, like allowed Ward Cleaver to earn enough for June to stay home and attend to life making, was essentially a stipend for June's housework and child-rearing labor that turned out in the long run to be much more than capitalists in America were willing to pay. A classic example of capitalists' unwillingness to shoulder the costs of social reproduction, even though they need it, can be found in their reactions to workers' pregnancies. This is something I've written a bunch about. So a boss who refuses to hire or accommodate a pregnant woman, which it's complicated, but in many ways is illegal even in the United States, but very common, is communicating clearly that he is unwilling to pay to support the next generation of workers. Anyone caring for a baby presents a problem for a capitalist because babies are, as the writer Mosa Kasich recently put it, time murdering. They create zero value for the employer and they compete for the employee's time. while capitalists in the future do need people to work and make profits for them. So in some sense, they have an interest in these babies. Capitalists of the present could not care less about those future capitalists' need for healthy, well-educated, well-nourished workers, any more than those same present-day tycoons worry about how climate apocalypse might affect their 2050 counterparts. Like the health of the planet, the well-being of children is one of those issues that makes jarringly clear that capitalists have no long-term commitment to capitalism. They may have no real short-term commitment to it either. The Marxist thinker James O'Connor argued back in 1988 that capitalism has a tendency to neglect or destroy all of the things that make it possible: nature, infrastructure, communities, families. The basis for social reproduction theory can be found in the writings of Vladimir Lenin, which I believe you guys are going to be reading in night school, as well as of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The theory came into its own in the late 60s as second wave feminism upended households and produced a cohort of left feminist intellectuals like Selma James and Sylvia Federici. They wanted to apply materialist analysis to the experience of women and force materialist socialists to account for women's mostly unwaged labor in the home. A Canadian chemistry professor named Margaret Benston analyzed the political economy of women's unpaid work and is credited for sparking some of the debates that led to the international wages for housework movement, which advanced social reproduction theory as kind of a body of thought. In the 70s and 80s, some of the most insightful socialist feminist thinkers along these lines were Black women, like the Barbara Smith and others in the Combat U River Collective, and Angela Davis. One of the reasons for this probably is that race is an amplifier. When we say that women do the work of life making in our society, this is especially true of Black women. Because of the history of slavery in this country, a white ruling class became accustomed to Black women's housekeeping and caregiving labor. After centuries, women who perform that work are still very exploited, and as the story of the Harvard president shows us, very invisible. When we say that bosses benefit from the cheapening and devaluing of women's labor, this is even more true of what Black women experience. As well as Black feminist thought is largely free of and often actively in tension with the misandry that runs through bourgeois white feminist thought. The reason for that is, just as Kallentai argued of the proletarian women before the Russian Revolution, Black women have had to look to men as comrades in struggle. You won't beat the white ruling class if you've decided that everyone toiling, struggling beside you in your home is your enemy. The influence of social reproduction theory waned in the 80s and 90s and early aughts with the waning of the socialist tradition more generally, and liberal feminism had a real moment. But in recent years, social reproduction theory has made a dynamic comeback, and even more so has socialist feminism more broadly. It's time. Here are some of the reasons why it's time. Decent and affordable childcare in the United States has been scandalously hard to come by ever since women began entering the workforce in greater numbers. Having children is a leading cause of poverty in the United States. Childcare workers are paid disastrously low wages, an average of $11 an hour. Despite, and this, going back to sort of the lack of interest of capitalists in the long term, Despite the well-established emotional and intellectual importance of the first 3 years of human development, daycare receives very little oversight or investment. And it's the caring for children is left very much up to parents. It's very much considered an individual responsibility. The crisis in social reproduction is also the handiwork of governments. All over the world, states have grown less generous in helping workers take care of the rest of their lives, especially their children. There's been less public money for childcare and K-12 education, even in the more generous Western democracies. And in the United States, that situation is especially bad. Austerity results in cutbacks to public services, which creates more work for women at home, but also hammers those women who are public sector workers. Adding insult to injury, when workers' wages are squeezed and their safety nets weaken, they find it more difficult to leave abusive relationships and workplaces. As states have weakened their social welfare functions and strengthened the power of workers, something that many intellectuals call neoliberalism, life-giving institutions and processes, and above all, the workers performing that life-giving work, whether at home or as a job, suffer. Most of those workers are women. Maybe at this point, we're taking neoliberalism a bit personally. Yeah, me too. The crisis of capitalism is a particular crisis for women who were already working too hard, but it is also a crisis for everybody, and the crisis of caregiving is a crisis for everybody. Our gut feeling about the truth of this statement is a good start, but its best empirical measures are things like time use surveys, studies of how people spend their time. According to such research, women spend twice as much time as men house cleaning and preparing food. They spend 3 times as much time on laundry, 4 times as much physical care of children. And to look at this crisis of social reproduction even before the recent sort of hyper crisis of which was the pandemic, is always to pose a question: how much labor can women possibly perform at once? It's also, you can also look at it as how little care, quality care can the human race sustain. I mean, all of this sort of overburdening of women is sort of results in, lesser care for children, lesser care for elderly people, less well-run households for everyone, lesser public education for everyone. I mean, it's really an all-around crisis of care that affects all of us, even if we're not, children or elderly or sick. In her 2019 book, Birth Strike, which I recommend, Jenny Brown argues that ordinary women are resisting these impossible working conditions by doing what sensible people do in such situations, which is by going on strike. Birth rates are declining, she argues, because women are refusing the labor of reproduction. The conditions for it have become too unacceptable. And she points out this really raises the stakes for abortion politics, that the right-wing assault on abortion rights persistently forecloses and complicates women's ability to refuse and resist labor that is becoming more and more difficult to perform well, and indeed to perform at all. She doesn't talk about this, but I would add that the climate crisis really amplifies that situation. And that a lot of people seem to be responding to it by going on birth strike as well. So both communist and social democratic societies have sought to improve the situation of women, and specifically of care work, often successfully. If we look at how Colin Tye's ideas worked out in practice when the Bolshevik government took power and she was a minister, she did implement some of her plans for maternity leave and maternity homes. The Bolsheviks generally made fun of her free love ideas, as did her political enemies throughout her life. And she noted with annoyance that the Bolshevik regime was no more progressive on sexual politics than many liberal Western democracies. She was mad that some Western democracies legalized homosexuality before the Bolsheviks did. But they eased divorce. They abolished the concept of child illegitimacy. They did legalize homosexuality. They did legalize abortion, but Stalin subsequently banned it in 1936 in order to keep up birth rates. Like many capitalist leaders, he faced future labor shortages and found Colin Tye's preferred approach, making motherhood easier and more joyful, to be too expensive. He had this in common with many capitalist leaders. But on the other hand, looking at the larger impact of her ideas and of socialist feminism, many Soviet bloc countries, as well as communist China and communist Vietnam, made huge strides in women's equality by providing universal childcare, female workforce participation, a lot of amazing propaganda on the importance of female workers, which does make a difference. They would depict these like large, powerful women wielding scythes and driving tractors, and the flying planes. I mean, and it's all that stuff makes a difference in people's attitudes. Especially in East Germany and Yugoslavia, they were able to make significant advances to women's equality on the job, but also to reduce the inequality of care work by socializing it. And to Colin Tye's argument that communism would improve women's sex lives, scholar Kristen Gotzi has actually argued convincingly in a book called Why Women Have Better Sex Under Communism that this was the case. The sexologists who studied women in East Germany versus West Germany found women in communist regimes happier with their intimate lives, possibly due to less economic stress, more economic independence for women, allowing them to have higher standards for men, less commodified human relations, and more time for friendship and families and other things that make life good. So the larger idea here, and probably what was successful in these situations, is that getting rid of capitalism and the capitalist class allows for a public sector that isn't just a sector, it's all of economic life. And that means it can be organized in the public interest to educate and care for children, to pay workers a living wage, to ensure clean water and clean air. And women almost always benefit from any steps that society makes in this direction. The Nordic countries still have capitalism, but with a more robust welfare state and public sector, the condition of women is still a lot better. Nordic countries have tended to favor universal programs that lessen the labor of the home and make the family more optional with childcare, high quality education, and other public services. So in Iceland, for example, single motherhood is largely unstigmatized. It's not unusual for women to have multiple children by different partners, but there is no effect on their well-being or their chance of survival. Brooklyn College political scientist Janet Johnson called Iceland the most feminist country in 2011, and it still tops the World Economic Forum's annual gender equity rankings. And that actually what's even more interesting than that is that the next three runners up are Norway, Finland, Sweden, all of whom also take this decommodified approach to caregiving and to family policy, supporting children through universal programs. Finland's education system is often seen as one of the best in the world, rather than freeing parents to spend more time at home, which is what some of the liberal Western democracies do. Sweden does not even permit homeschooling, but they actually fine parents for keeping kids at home, which we would really consider an affront to our personal liberty here in the United States, but it works pretty well there. It's important and telling that this approach gets these countries to the top of the very bourgeois World Economic Forum's gender equity rankings. These are not socialist metrics that the World Economic Forum is measuring. What they're measuring is political empowerment, health and survival, educational attainment, economic participation. Those are actually the same things that bourgeois feminists want. Those are the same things that liberal feminists like Hillary Clinton would say that they want. But what the data demonstrates is that the only way to reach liberal feminist goals is by moving closer to socialism.
Thank you, Liza. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much. So for people dialing in on Zoom, please feel free to put any questions in the chat. And then we're going to have Carly read the community agreements before we get started.
All right, so reminder for everyone, everybody's here to learn, so assume good intentions, assume good faith, and be comradely. Please get on Stack if you would like to ask a question. So if you are online, type Stack in the chat. If you're here, you probably do like a little hand raise. I'm gonna say this phrase because I love it. One Devo, one mic. So if someone else is talking or asking a question, everyone else is being quiet and listening. And try to be brief with your questions, like under 30 seconds-ish.
Here.
So I'm going to take Q&A. So as Anjali probably just mentioned, they're going to be stacked. Do you want me to keep track of?
Jorge's going to keep track of the chat.
Okay, cool.
Just can't see. Is Ashley in the picture? I think we had some starter questions.
Yeah, sure. No one has, does anyone have a that?
I just agree with, like, obviously the vast majority of what you said, and but I do have a question. I just have a question about the problem of kind of sexism and misogyny in everyday life, right? It's not only bosses who catcall or worse, right? So how does socialist feminism deal with the problem of male workers who internalized capitalist sexist values?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that, you know, a concern with that is something that socialist feminists share with bourgeois feminists, right? Like, we don't like misogyny, we don't like harassment. And I think that, I mean, I think that there's a number of approaches to that. I think, like a lot of other forms of social conflict, I think we find that, that political solidarity can help. So in the workplace, often organizing together towards a common goal can increase respect, like among each other, and can it's not a cure, but it can definitely alleviate both gender and race and other kinds of tensions. I think that solidarity and respect can go a long way, but at the same time, and it certainly has to be identified and often mocked, wherever possible. I think it should be, I think it should always be called out for the sometimes ugliness and sometimes just purely ridiculousness that it is. But at the same time, I also think that it's really important not to make an obsession of it, as I think that is common in bourgeois feminism. I think it's common, and I think we see that especially in the last few years. There's been a kind of a morbid fascination with it almost by bourgeois feminists, that to really fixate on the worst aspects of gender relations and the most violent things that men do and the most sort of disgusting and pathetic things that men do, and I think that that's those things are unfortunate, but at the same time the fixation on them I don't think is politically productive, because taken alone they don't have a solution. They have a solution in the sense that as we struggle for a society in which the genders are more equal and women have more respect, those things will be lesser. So they absolutely are problems, but the solutions are bigger than the problems themselves, and I think the sort of cultural fixation on them is something that I find troubling.
Anyone else want to help on stop? Or we?
Yeah, thank you for speaking. It's been really interesting. You mentioned the wages for housework movement, and I was interested if maybe you could speak about that specific movement a little bit more, and if maybe you think that that's something that we as socialists should be agitating for, because it struck me as everything we read talked about the dialectical of socialism and feminism. That seems like a really good kind of synthesis for those two things.
Yeah, that is such a great question. The wages for housework was a small but very influential movement of women, demanding, kind of as a provocation, that women be paid for housework. There was not so much a serious. It was not like they had legislation that they were organizing around, but there was definitely a provocation and a sort of a body of work and analysis, and the funny thing is that we actually see we're actually seeing the basis of some of that today that could be extended. So, for example, the child tax credit during the pandemic was essentially a small stipend for reproductive labor in the home, for men, for parents of all genders, and I've had some correspondence with Selma James about it, and she was really excited. And she was like, this is like, we didn't actually think that something like this in the United States would happen, that women would like actually be receiving wages for housework. And so, so we actually, there is the possibility of a broader political demand that could be made. The child tax credit could be extended. Parents could be, compensated for reproductive labor in broader ways, in all kinds of other ways. But I think that it's kind of an interesting practical thing that we've seen recently, and that could be developed further. Do we want to?
I kind of have a question.
I don't know how well formulated this is, but it seems to me, you touched on it a little bit when you quoted someone talking about capitalism treating poorly things it needs to sustain it. But I see this even in socialism, like things that are like the earth is generative, right? Agriculture is generative. I see in the socialist movement, interest in the farm workers, but not in farming really. There's some there sort of like in like the DSA kind of socialist, not like the global south was different, but in the sort of global north.
Cuba is a model.
What is it?
Cuba is a model of generative farming.
Is it?
In many ways.
And it's respected, but I feel like in the US, we don't get, like these circles, we don't see a lot of attention given to like production of food, like from the earth, right? But I think it's a macro level of, I think it's kind of viewed as women's work a little. Yeah, just on a macro level, like if you understand what I'm saying, I wonder if you have thoughts on it. Am I putting big questions?
No, I think that's really interesting. I think that I think that care for the earth actually is I think that it's sort of perhaps in some ways denigrated because it is a form of care, it is a form of care, it is a form of social reproduction in some sense. So in a sort of in a sort of sexist worldview, it might be dismissed as being not really a material issue. I think that is changing a little bit. I think that we are seeing more of the climate crisis is sort of forcing socialists to center. There have always been eco-socialist thinkers, and in the 19th century, even going back to Marx, that there was some thinking about the exploitation of nature. But I think we're seeing the climate crisis is forcing socialists to center the environment a bit more. I do think that, it is interesting. There's been a lot of activism and sort of consciousness in the general progressive movement about food and where it comes from and where, and how to make it more sustainable. And I agree with you, actually, there hasn't really been, the socialist movement hasn't fully engaged with that, I think. And I think to some extent, it's, you might, I think that's perceptive that it might be a little bit of a sort of sexism, or a sense that that's women's terrain, pun intended, but I also think that I think it's also sort of a sense that it's a liberal thing, like because liberals are doing it, and I think that's wrong. Like I think that the reform of our food system strikes at the heart of the rot of the capitalist system. The way that like food that is bad for us is produced for only for profit reasons, and it is destroying the earth and it's destroying our bodies, and it's just like it's actually a great socialist issue. I mean, and we should be concerned with it. But I agree, there is something. I think that another part of it is there's a sort of a lifestyle politics associated with it that, and socialists kind of rightly resist resist politics that stress individual lifestyle changes. But we should get beyond that and recognize it as a big issue for our politics and our theories. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I'm mentioning about this. This morning, what happened this week? I appreciate, but what happened this week that they are cutting down the trees because I know that they cutting down trees. And then they have to they have to close the gate for the destruction. And one of them was arrested yesterday, right in East River.
Oh, like in the East River Park?
Yeah, I was there 2 days in a row. I was there yesterday and today. Sandra got arrested, and Sandra got today. So, because they had to cut down the trees, those wasn't not the East River had to say. That's all I have to say.
Do you want me to say something about the East River Park issue?
Yes.
Yeah, happy to. That's actually a great little microcosm of a lot of what we're talking about. The community is protesting a plan to temporarily destroy the East River Park, which is the only real public parks land of any significance on the Lower East Side, and is so crucial for the care of people and for people to be outside and children being outside. Our son plays on baseball fields a lot, even though we don't even live in that neighborhood. And at the same time, there is a need to mitigate the effect of climate change on the neighborhood, and it's a huge it is a huge conflict pitting the community against the city planners. In some sense, though, it's a good problem to have, because it isn't the community versus a capitalist developer. It's the community versus the city trying to plan ahead about climate change. So it's actually kind of one of our better problems that we're facing in New York City. It's like it is very sad to lose this park, even for a little while. But on the other hand, we are kind of lucky in New York City that we do have a city government that is trying to protect the neighborhood and protect the housing projects being flooded. So complicated issue.
Do you have anyone on Slack online?
No.
Okay.
Sorry for the cliche question, but I guess I want to ask, there's an emphasis on diversity and inclusion, that kind of stuff, and we know that ultimately that won't resolve the problems. But at the same time, if you bring those up, there's a strong resistance, and you can't deny that they do play a part. So I'm wondering, how do you resolve these things, and how do you discuss that kind of stuff in a fruitful way? How do you balance what you work for, diversity, more women, etc., and
the more meaningful bills and law.
Yeah, good question. I think that, I think that sometimes we see socialists falling into the trap of like just always being against, any rhetoric around diversity and inclusion because it's not, because it's not socialist. I mean, and because it's perfectly true that capitalism can be diverse, capitalism can be feminist, capitalism can accommodate multiculturalism, it can accommodate feminism, a certain kind of feminism, and can include many discriminated against groups, and so because of that, I think sometimes socialists sort of just go all out to just like be like, well, it's just totally meaningless, but it is not totally meaningless to make some progress on those issues. It's not totally meaningless to make capitalism more responsive to minority groups, to be more racially just or more feminist. It's just not the whole transformation that we're fighting for, and we should be on the lookout for for feminism or multiculturalism or anti-racism to be used against us. We should support all of those struggles for racial justice and gender justice, but we should also be aware that those things can also be deployed against socialists and used to divide people, and we should be vigilant against that as well.
Do you have anyone else who wants to help?
Yeah, hi, thank you for your presentation. So in the period since the beginning of the modern feminist women's movement, the terminology and thinking has come much more broadly into American society over time. And then in the last period, with the rise of the right, you see a big counter trend, and that counter trend is especially vivid about the position of women. I'm wondering what you think the class basis of that is.
Yeah. So I think that we see a worldwide interest in the far right, and not only by men, but men are definitely a big part of it. I do think that part of the reason for it, and some of it is some of it is a class war from above, like some of it, sometimes in some cases it's like, people who own a little something and they don't want to give it up. And that's actually a huge part, and I think is underrated, but in our understanding often. But it is also, I think, the case that liberal feminism doesn't have much to offer men, and I think that is part of what is fueling the global far right. That it's like, if you're asked to give up a certain amount of privilege in the workplace and in the home, with a socialist agenda, you really gain a lot back, like your entire life will be improved, at work and, in the public sphere and at home, but in a liberal paradigm, what do you gain for giving up all that as a man? I mean, I think it's nice that any men are feminists at all, honestly. I mean, after that paradigm, and then also, liberalism is just constantly telling, men that they're the problem, and I think men kind of get tired of hearing that.
Hot take. Anyone else want to help us back? Okay.
Men are never.
I have a question. What would you say what has been the role of women of color in the history of socialist feminism?
Yeah, I think really important. I think that when we look at feminist thought in the United States, in the 1970s, feminism, particularly in the late 70s, it was really women of color that were keeping feminism alive at all, because it sort of began to receive, with the Reagan Revolution and the sort of greater conservatism and backlash, but also the explosion of women of color feminism that we saw in the late 70s and 80s was really brought feminist thought much further to the left, as women of color were examining the conditions of their own lives, which tended to be much more working class lives, and really looking at these kinds of contradictions in caregiving and labor within the home, and I think that that's really like when we think of the socialist feminist tradition, and especially feminist social reproduction, that women of color, but really specifically Black women, made huge contributions to that.
Hi, so I've been reading Nixon Land by Rick Perlstein, and he argues that the Reagan-Nixon reaction was kind of an aesthetic reaction to a kind of the hysteria, I guess, and the militancy of the 1960s. And how do we balance the kind of righteous rage of women and also of the Black militancy at the time, and also the reaction against the horror of the Vietnam War, and the fact that these changes to socializing social production really are destructive of the foundations of society in a way that predates capitalism by thousands of years, and the dislocation and the fear that produces. Like, how do we? I think I know what you're going to say, because you've been saying it, like the fact that what we offers to everyone, but like there's this fear as well, and also like at the time as well, that like the people advocating this were college students a lot, and they had a dismissive and a contemptuous approach to working class people who were afraid of that disruption. So how do we do this revolutionary, very, very, very basic stuff without not that we're going to be afraid, but how do we do it? Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know, honestly. No, I know that's not really a very good answer. I mean, yeah, no, it's a really good question. People are really afraid of change. I think that I think that a lot of it is that it's very hard be the fervor of, right, of the extreme right to defend the extreme right has a fervor for defending the status quo. And I think that it's been really hard for middle of the road centrists, the center left to counter that, because it's not, it doesn't hit people as intimately. I mean, it doesn't really offer anything. And I do think that I don't think that you can counter all the anger this way, but I think you can counter a lot of it by concretely improving people's lives. You know, by like a program that concretely improves people's lives. And we've seen in our own organizing, even PSA, as like even as relatively small as we are, we have seen that people really do respond well to victories that improve their lives, and to organizing that explains how we're going to do that. So I think I think that that just like that the nitty gritty of that really does go a long way.
Anyone else like to get on stop? Also, how are we on time?
I think we're asking a lot of our speaker. She's been speaking for an hour and 20 minutes.
I wasn't like going on strike by saying I didn't know the answer to it.
I didn't think you were. I just was looking at the time and thinking it was a little unfair. And I wonder if we want to ask questions of people who are here, like attending, to formulate their own thoughts, like it's tricky because we're doing, sorry, I'll just say this. We're sort of doing hybrid night school now. Like last year we did Zoom, and the year before we did in person, and the year before that in person. And so combining it, it's sort of different. Like we would normally before do breakouts where we would ask people like, what is socialist feminism? What makes it different from non-socialist feminism? And I wonder if anyone has like, I mean, it's useful in political education to learn how to articulate things yourself and not just, be spoon-fed it by wonderful speakers. But I wonder if anyone has wants to give that one a try. What is socialist feminism and what makes it different from non-socialist feminism? We only have a few minutes, so we'll only ask surprise questions of a couple people. You want to try?
Sure. Yeah, I'm gonna try to paraphrase the first reading mostly because it's where I got most of this, but basically there's socialism and feminism, and there is, I guess, the potentiality for them to exist as like hybrid ideologies that are side by side. But the writer was arguing that there is a true, I think, synthesis or intersectionality between these two viewpoints, because they both involve, there are a lot of commonalities, but there are a lot of differences too, but they both involve overcoming hegemonies. And it contrasts with, I guess, bourgeois or liberal feminism, because bourgeois liberal feminism ignores class. But then on the other side, there are what she refers to as the machine Marxists, who I think are class exclusionists, maybe is the word I'm looking for. Like they only focus on class and do not like look at the greater cultural situation that people are in as individuals. So that was my reading.
And be comradely to bring them past that.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
think class reductionism.
Reductionism, that was the word, yeah.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. Does someone else want to give it a try? Anyone else? We'll move on to another question.
Actually, people might have these questions in their lap. If there's one that speaks to you and you want to answer, feel free. But how about as socialists, how can we work? Oh, did you have a question?
I didn't really have a question. I wanted to go back to the little discussion that was going on here. And I feel that it's important for socialists to live amongst the people and to have friends that with the people that they're organizing and the people they go to work with and the people that's in their neighborhoods, and to present their ideas to those people in a person-to-person kind of way. And by doing that, come to understand how to present these ideas in a living way that represents the thinking of the people and not the college academic kind of a presentation. And in the long run, I think that's the only way to bridge that gap and that resentment.
Do we have time for a couple more?
Probably have time for like another one. Like as socialists, how can we work toward gender equity? Which I guess Lee was touching on, but maybe others have ideas.
No wrong answers, guys.
I have one. As someone who organizes a lot with DSA, I would recommend men volunteer to take notes. And what are other goals that women do? Like you'll see in organizing all the time, like women are always like, I'll take the notes, or they'll do the behind the scenes organizing, and the guys will like grab the microphone and be like, I'll do this part, you know? Emails, yeah. There are a lot of the work that's not so glamorous. Often involves women, and it is so wonderful when like to see men just PSA here, the DSA PSA that yeah, stepping up to do sort of admin work. It's a good one.
Yeah, and actually, in the 60s, a lot of organizations really suffered from gender divisions around it, like tensions around men not doing stuff like that, and it was, I mean, you know, it was even worse because like they would expect the women to cook for them and make the coffee at the meetings and stuff, you know, so it was more extreme than here, but yeah, taking notes is kind of one of those many lingering things. Emotional labor in organizing spaces, like doing the things to make people feel better.
Okay. Anyone else want to share any thoughts on gender equity?
I think we can wrap it up.
Oh,
Does.
What thought?
what are thoughts?
Yes,
Oh, your opinion, like on the question about gender equity.
yeah.
I think we're ready to wrap up. If no one has any other questions, we have a bunch of announcements to make for things that are on the horizon. But first, thank you so much, Liza, for coming here. You are so great to listen to forever. And then we have announcements for upcoming events. Do you want to do the announcements, or do you want to read them? Maybe Jorge, do you want to read them? And you can see,
Okay, sure.
copy
Or-
this them.
I could read one. Actually, you might be, do you know where the things are?
They're right here.
Okay, I'll
Do we even
read,
need to?
I'll read it all. I'm okay. I just don't know where they are. All right, everyone.
They're right here, if you want to do.
So we
Speaking
have,
of productive
some
labor.
announcements here. Next Tuesday, December 14th, will be our final night school
Like that.
session of the semester.
See?
For sure. And please note that it's next week or the 14th. Usually we do 2 weeks. It'll be about social movements and class struggle. Rachel Himes of the RJWG will facilitate. And we have a link that's there in the chat coming soon.
Racial Justice Working Group.
Racial Justice Working Group, thank you. Another announcement, North Brooklyn Polyed will be hosting January Lenin sessions. So please join us for 4 Saturdays. Woo! 4 Saturdays in January, starting January 8th, where we'll discuss state and revolution, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and others. So January, Lenin January. Please turn out. Yeah, another thing, oh shoot. I don't know what this, there we go, sorry. Night school spring semester is turning up on February 1st, 2022. Come out for that. Another one, let's see, support the Teamsters every Tuesday from 7 to 10 a.m. in Greenpoint. I've been to this is really good. It's actually against this horrible thing. I think it's like an energy transfer station, and it's owned by John Catsimatidis. And we came up with this great chant last time. It was.
Remember, I was there this morning.
Oh, were you?
Yeah, I was there this morning.
Oh, great. Someone was there this morning. Thanks, comrade. So yeah, we had this great chant, which was Catsimatidis, you can't beat us. You can't beat us. Yeah. You really want to jazz up your Tuesday mornings at 7 a.m. at Greenpoint. All right. So another one, join DSA. Keep bringing people into the struggle. So 100,000 K, it's another campaign, I imagine. I should know this, I don't.
It's not, it's a cut and paste from last year and it should be deleted.
Oh, okay, it's a cut and paste from last year. We don't talk about that. All right. Please do join DSA. Yes, we're here to tell you to if you're not already signed up, it's well worth it. Another thing, please get involved with Socialist Feminist Working Group, and they have an email, socialist.feminism@socialists.nyc. I have a mask on, it's really hard to talk, I apologize. This looks like is the fundraiser going on at our Wicked Lady? Is that current?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but also social, important to mention.
Oh, okay, yeah, so there's an NBK social and fundraiser for UMEC workers at Our Wicked Lady on December 17th. Please head out to that. Finally, we are Poly-Ed, North Brooklyn's Poly-Ed, yours truly included. We have an email, you want to get involved, that's nbk.poly.ed@socialists.nyc. Please come join us. Come out to our events and join the committee if you want. Thanks.
That's all for tonight. We'll stop recording now. But thanks again, everyone, for coming out. And please